Okay, just waiting for YouTube to boot up.
Sounds good. I'm organizing my desktop.
Okay, and we are live on YouTube. So we are recording at this point. And it is 5 o'clock. I am going to open the waiting room.
Very good.
Hello?
Hello.
Hello.
Okay, we're just going to make sure we get everybody who's in the waiting room in here before we start.
Hey, George
looks like that
Toth,
was
I see your
everyone who's
face.
in the waiting room. Okay, so we can get things started. Thank you, everyone, for joining us here for the special interest group on lenticulars. I am going to turn the reins over to Michael Brown, a incredibly talented photographer and lenticular artist, and he is going to host this presentation for you today. He'll be starting with his own short presentation, and then we'll open it up to everybody else. Take it away, Michael.
Thank you, Eric. Welcome, everyone. I see a lot of familiar faces from past NSAs. Appreciate your coming to this evening's Lenticular SIG. So what I want to do is the SIG is scheduled for about an hour long. I'd like to start off with maybe a 15-minute little monologue, share some resources that you might be interested in. I've also pasted into the chat, and Eric later will continue to paste that in periodically, a link to a PDF document that has all sorts of resources pertaining to 3D lenticular. And what's great about that document is when you open it up, you can click on any of the hyperlinks and it'll take you right to the website. So it's good to use that in conjunction with your web browser. So to begin, let me adjust my screen here. So what you're seeing in my background is my art festival booth. I don't know if you all know this, but I'm actually a full-time lenticular artist doing both 3D and kinetic artwork. And I travel around the country during non-COVID periods and show and sell my artwork. Now, we're not going to have that on all night. We're actually going to go to this beautiful gray backdrop. Now, at this point, I'm going to share my screen, and we're going to look at this PDF document. So my hope is that everyone can see that online right now. Is that true, Eric?
We're not seeing it yet.
We are not. Oh, yes, pilot error. I must
yeah.
hit the share button. I'm assuming that is visible.
Yes, we are seeing it now.
Thank you. Okay, so the first thing on this presentation material, this link says 3D lenticular tools and techniques. That's similar to a presentation I've given at NSA in the past, but it's more comprehensive, more pictures, more details. There's an audio commentary. You click on that, it takes you right to YouTube. So it's basically an hour-long course on 3D lenticular. On the PDF, the line below talks about a Facebook group. I actually moderate a Facebook group on lenticular art. It has about 200 members. You're all welcome to join. It's free to join, but there's a caveat there. If someone hasn't posted within 6 months, I delete them from the group. They can always join back in, but I like to keep it just a small, active number of people. So if you're on Facebook, and I know a lot of people don't like Facebook, but if you're on it, please feel free to join our lenticular art and artist group. I have another thing listed under video. It's a YouTube channel. If you go there, there are actually videos of me in the studio making artwork. As orders come in, occasionally I'll do live streaming where people can actually see how I interlace the pictures, how I print them out, how I bond the lens to it. Nancy and I completed one, Nancy, my wife, and I recently completed one talking about matting and framing and finishing lenticular. So you can actually get a lot of behind the scenes information, seeing how a artist or practitioner makes lenticulars. Now there are some printed resources that I'd like to reference. 2 articles in ISU stereoscopy. So I'm sure you're all, hang on, let me go back. Stop you back temporarily. ISU journal. So this one, number 108, has an article going from stereo pairs to lenticular prints. Sorry about this crazy screen. It's not really mirroring. And then this one here, issue 109, goes through the whole process of printing, interlacing, printing, you know, what you want to do as far as inkjet printing and setting your drivers and so forth. So those are printed resources. There are links to those that will take you right to the ISU site where you can get that. Now, there have been a couple books published in the past few years on lenticular. This first one I'm going to hold up. This is Itzik Weissman's book on lenticular imaging. Quite technical and theoretical. You know, there's a lot of math and science in there, how the things work, but also there are some practical aspects. So this page here, hard to read, but it's talking about using a slider and shooting intervals for creating lenticular pictures. So that's one resource. And then if you're interested in the history of lenticular, there's this book here by Kim Timby, 3D and Animated Lenticular Photography, very detailed, written very scholarly. If you like those presentations this morning, you might like this book. I'm not very good at flipping backwards, but this, for example, here's some illustrations of the Maurice Bonnet camera from the 1940s. You know, and the book is just filled with all sorts of illustrations, black and white and color. So highly recommended. Not exactly inexpensive. You can get this on Amazon. It's about $80. I think Itzik's book is about $30. But there's not a lot of written on lenticular, and there never has been. So it's nice to have these printed resources. I'm going to go back to sharing my screen and back to this PDF. So often I'm asked about lenticular software. You can get either free software to create lenticular prints, or you can purchase commercial software. So there are 2 free programs. One is called Superflip, and if you click on that link, it'll take you to a place you can download it. And there's a new one that just came out this year. Itzik developed it. It's called Grape. It runs on a PC and it's free. And then commercial softwares, there's a host of them listed here. There's a half dozen programs there. There's a new one called AnyView that just came out this past year. And the very bottom one I have listed is called Lentigram, and that's been just updated to its version 2.0. That's the software I personally use, and so I can recommend that. Page 2 of this document talks about the white polyester film you would use in an inkjet printer. And there are links to the B&H site where you can get that. And then I had a conversation recently with a fellow out in Brooklyn who prints lenticulars for others. And he was telling me he doesn't use the polyester film, but he's had good results with Epson metallic paper. Now, I haven't used that myself, but he definitely endorsed it. So other useful software, I have here listed Stereo Photomaker. We're all familiar with that, right? It's been updated in the past year or two, and now you can actually make depth maps from stereo pairs, which is very beneficial in doing lenticular printing. And there's even a mode where once you have your image and your depth map, you can render a series of frames for making a lenticular, and the software will even interlace as well. So Stereo Photomaker, it's an order magnitude of where it was, you know, even 3 or 4 years ago. And then the next program I've listed is called Triaxis Stereo Tracer. That is a specific software program to take in a stereo pair, like you might have from a Fuji W series camera or scan stereo realist slides, and it will take the stereo pair and make a depth map, and then also make the individual files you need to interlace for lenticular. After that, I talked about 3D lenticular sheet suppliers, because people often get interested in this. They want to know where to get lenses. Here in the United States, we're lucky. We have 2 sources micro lens in North Carolina, and view through out in Las Vegas. And if you're over in Europe, DP Lenticular is a source for lenticular sheets over there. Now, a couple of the remaining items will be more clear as we get into our conversation later. I have a link for a trigger box that allows you to synchronize multiple cameras. I have a link for a portable slider, which is very handy if you like working in the field. And then a couple service providers. If you decide you don't want to make your own lenticulars, there's a couple of guys that actually belong to NSA or frequent our conferences, and they do that type of work for you. One is Mark Diamond, one is Harvey Jewett. And so links to their sites are on this document as well. So now I want to stop sharing my screen. And I'm back. All right, so first thing I want to do is just talk a little bit about cameras. So here on the screen, I'm sure many of you recognize this camera. It's the Nimslo. It came out in the early 80s. This particular camera I purchased in the early 80s when they're brand new. I probably paid, $250 for this. And so it's a 35mm point and shoot camera, 4 lenses. The interocular is basically the distance of the human eyes, the outer interocular. And when you would use this Nimslo camera, you'd load it with 35mm film. It would take 2 full frames, and in that width, it would actually make 4 half-frame images in vertical portrait orientation. You'd send your film away for processing, and you get little pictures like this. These haven't really withstood the test of time very well. There's a little light fade, but the reason I bring this up is you can make your own Nimslo prints. If you have a Nimslo camera, it's so hard for me to work backwards like this plug in. If you have your own Nimslo camera, you can make your prints. Now I'm going to rotate this. They don't have tremendous parallax. There are ways for compensating for that as well. So any of you that purchased a Nimslo years ago, if you want to make prints from them, you can do it. It's not as inexpensive as when the cameras first came out, because of course you have to get the lenticular sheets and the software and so forth. But like most types of photography, you take hundreds of images, thousands of images. I'm sure we all have perhaps tens of thousands of images, but there are only certain ones that are wall-worthy or that you might want to share with someone, and those would be the ones to print yourself. So Nimslo, analog camera system, the depth from this camera was not tremendous. It actually, when I look at a picture like this, maybe it has a 1/2 inch of depth in front of it and a 1/2 inch behind it. So not really perfect. And one of the reasons for that is the stereo base. So I'm just gonna call up this picture. So this camera is called the Birdlow. It's a handmade camera by David Birder in London. And he would take Nimslos, cut them apart, splice them together. And he had some cameras with 2 Nimslos, 3 Nimslos in this example, and one that even had 4 Nimslos. And by doing that, he was able to get this wider stereo base. And that provides more depth in the 3D photographs. So the Nimslo, by its design limitations, because it had to use 35mm film, be economical, they had a small number of lenses, they had them close together. So we're going to take the Nimslo off, and I'm going to see if I can do this. A lot of controls on the back end here, sorry. Now I'm going to come over here and put up a different camera system. All right, back that up a bit. Lower that. So this, in essence, is a digital Nimslo. It's 4 cameras. These are Sony RX0 Mark IIs. They can be fired via USB. There's a box below here. This is called the Esper trigger box. And this box will actually allow you to sync up to 6 cameras. Now, years ago, I was actually using Canon point and shoot cameras and Stereo Data Maker to sync those simultaneously. But I was always frustrated with the particular Canons I used because they didn't provide RAW files. And they also had a lens that was more of a normal lens. It had a 40mm equivalent lens. For my 3D, I like more of a wide angle view. So these Sonys provide raw files, and they actually have a wide angle lens array. So that's pretty nice. Now this Esper box, it's bigger than the cameras, right? It has to be powered. And so I actually take a little USB battery that's taped to the tripod, and I plug that in. And then I actually fire the camera, with a little handheld remote. So if I press the button halfway, it locks in the focus. I press it the rest of the way, and it takes the picture. And so now you can use this type of camera or a NIMSLO to make wiggle GIFs, or you can use this type of camera to make lenticular prints. I'm going to rotate this around a little bit. This side, you can see the ports that you plug the cameras into. I'm using 4 of the ports because I have 4 cameras. This side over here, you can see the power going in under that Esper trigger label, and then you can see the input for the remote control. There's a port not being used called link, and what that lets you do is connect multiple of these boxes in serial. So let's say you had a system that had 24 cameras. Each box uses 6 cameras. You could take 4 of these boxes and link them to all those cameras. Obviously, it wouldn't be very portable. It would be more of a studio application. And if I turn this around the back end, you can see the USB cables that are plugged into the camera. One of these cameras, I actually put a little tab tape here so I can take that viewfinder, and adjust it up and down, pull it out to get a little better view. So this is a multi-camera array that will let me take 4 pictures simultaneously. So it's great for moving subjects. If by chance you make it to my website and go to the social media links, on the Instagram link, I actually have wiggle GIFs made with this cameras. And one of them is a fountain with water splashing everywhere, and you can see the great sync. There's always been a debate on these Sony cameras. People say they have perfect sync. And people then say, well, what is perfect sync? And I don't know the answer to that question, but I do know that for my purposes, people, splashing water, things of that nature, the sync is just fine. If you want to photograph bullets in flight, might be a completely different animal. I should mention one last thing. It's a tiny technical detail, but might like it. When this is powered on, there's a little light on the side here that turns green, just like that. It's a button, and I can make that light go blue. And when you do that, it allows you to use software to program this box. So you could introduce a delay between different cameras, or you could introduce a delay if you wanted to fire an electronic flash unit. So it allows you to control each of these individually. Obviously for 3D work, we want them all to fire simultaneously. But if you're a creative and want to do some sort of animation, you could have one camera fire perhaps a millisecond after the other and so forth. So a little additional feature of that box. Now I'm all twisted up here, just a second. So the NIMSLO and the Sony multi-camera array are great for photographing things that move. There's a lot of 3D photography you can do of things that don't move. And one approach to take is to use a slider, like a video slider. And I think you've all seen them. They might be a 1 meter long bar. You put your camera on that and you slide the camera from one side to the other. It would look something like this. So this particular one doesn't have a head on it yet, but you can see slides across. For 3D lenticular, you generally want a wider stereo base than you would use for a stereo pair. Typically, you're looking at 3 to 6x the stereo base if you're using a 3D lenticular sheet. And if you're doing animations, you want somewhere between 6 and 12x the stereo base. So animations, what's that all about? I'll just hold up one real quick. So this picture is 3-dimensional, but as I rotate it, you can see this woman brings her finger up, says, shh, be quiet, and holds the book. So you get both 3D and motion. This is approximately 100 photographs in that. So the next little gizmo I want to share with you is this device here. So what this is a video slider, but the mechanics of it are different than what we just had. I'm a little constrained here due to my headset. So this is called the Edelkrone wing. And I'm just going to show you. It slides here and it slides there. It actually has 40 centimeters of travel, so about 15 and a half inches. So what's nice about this is it's very portable. You can put, in this case, I have, this little miniature Sony camera, Edelkrone wing. They could go in a very tiny camera bag along with a portable tripod. So it's very nice to use. Some great advancements in the past few years with cameras. Now this is just, the Sony RX100 is a point and shoot camera. This has great burst depth. If I hold down the shutter button and slide it across, it actually does 20 frames a second. So, and it has a burst depth of 70 frames. So in just a few seconds, I can take 70 pictures, and it's just terrific. Something that would have been unimaginable, 10 or 15 years ago. So I've showed you some camera equipment. I've talked about some resources. I guess what I'd like to do now is open it up to any question and answers. And I think a good way of doing that is to use the raise hand feature, and then either Eric can unmute people or they can unmute themselves, I'm guessing. Would that be a fair statement? Eric?
Yes. What I've done, I have made it, I'm going to make it so that people can unmute themselves, but please use that judiciously. We don't want to have a cacophony of everybody talking at once. So if we call on you, please wait for us to call on you, and then you'll be able to unmute yourself and we can have a discussion. And if you have a question that you'd like to ask, the easiest way to let us know is to go at the bottom of your screen, there's a button for participants. If you open the participants panel, there's a little symbol for a hand. If you click on that raised hand, it'll move you to the top of our list and we can call on you next.
Well, I hope they see that, because on mine, I don't have that.
Yes, okay. I do have it. I can see it. Okay, so first we're going to go, Max Clark has a question. Max, you should be able to unmute yourself.
Okay, great. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes, we hear you.
So a question about the Edelkrone wing that you just showed. If you're using that with the camera in burst mode, you're sort of manually pushing the camera at the same time that you're holding down the button?
Yes, that's correct.
Okay. And do you get a fairly steady rate of movement, lateral movement? Because that would be my concern.
Yeah, obviously practice helps. Yeah. But the great thing is, I mean, years ago, people would get these sliders that had indents, and they'd, take a picture, go a half inch, take a picture, go a half inch. I've learned over the years, it's really not necessary. Just slide your camera at a fairly constant rate. It works fine.
It's good to know.
Now, Michael, that raises a question that I have. I've seen some of your pieces. I've seen some of your pieces that I believe were actually shot with a stationary red video camera with the subject on a rotating seat.
Yes.
Can you talk about how that process works?
Sure. Well, for example, right now I'm on my little studio chair that rotates. The subject in this case, when we've done those, because you have like the zombie and perhaps the mariachi man.
Yeah.
So
I've got a couple in the museum. Yeah.
So that was actually done in conjunction with Adobe. Their creative director, Russell Brown, had me go out to Colorado. And what they would do is they had Hollywood makeup artists that came in and made up their software programmers as monsters, for lack of a better term. And we wanted to find an easy way of capturing lenticular 3D pictures of them. And I just sort of explored the animation like the picture I showed you. And so I came up with the idea, rather than having that camera arc around the subject, I would just have the subject on a chair and they would rotate their chair. The camera would be stationary and it was on a tripod. Red with support for 4K resolution was pretty new at that time. I can't even remember what year we did it. It may have been 8 years ago. So it's like, oh, wow, 4K. Well, of course, now our phones have 4K. So basically 4K, I can't remember if those were, I'm guessing at that time it was probably 30p, 24p or 30p. So I would have the model rotate fairly slowly like that. So maybe it would take them 2 or 3 seconds. So let's imagine it was 30 pictures, we'd end up with about 90 frames. Most of those that you have, Eric, were in a range of about 100 frames. The method of doing it like that is really terrific because the slider I showed you and demonstrated before, the camera was moving across in a linear manner. There are some sliders that allow you, as the camera is tracking across, it will actually toe in, which is nice. It keeps your subject centered. But the absolute best lenticular portraiture is when the camera arcs around the subject. And so either the camera stationary and the subject rotates, or the subject stationary and you arc the camera around them. And I actually have something called an orbital dolly, and I was trying to imagine today how I could demonstrate that here in the studio, but I just didn't have enough room behind me on the screen. But basically, it's wheels for a tripod, and you can dial in settings on this orbital dolly, and it will arc your tripod for a certain radius. You know, like if I want to be 6 feet away or 8 feet away, I can adjust it. And that's really the best way of doing portraiture, in my opinion, but it's the hardest way of doing it. If you end up going to my website and looking at my 3D collection, there's one that's a woman who's turning the page of a book. So she's in a living room environment. She's sitting down, she has this book, and I had the orbital dolly and I arced it around her. And as I was arcing, I asked her to turn a single page of that book. And she did, and it's one of my more successful kinetic three-dimensional pictures because you see her in 3D, and because of the way the camera moves, the entire perspective of the room changes. And that's what makes these arcing pictures so fascinating. It's not a technique I would recommend if you're doing landscapes or something. Lenticular already has a limited depth budget or depth of field. And when you arc it, the camera, that depth budget is reduced even more. To get the most depth of field, using the linear approach would be the way to go. So that was a good question.
I actually had the good fortune a little over a year ago to see one of the original Bonet cameras, and
Nice.
They have an arc. They have an arc on their track to go around the subject as well. So let's see. David Tide has a question. David, you can unmute yourself.
I think I'm unmuted. Do you hear me?
Long time no
Yes, we
see.
can
We
hear
hear you.
All right. It's pronounced TD.
Oh, TD. Yes, I'm sorry. I knew
That's
that.
Yeah, it rhymes with 3D.
It's been a long day.
It rhymes with 3D. So I should remember that.
Yes.
TD 3D.
Great way to remember. I will never get that wrong again.
That's part of my email address, TD3D. Any rate,
Wonderful.
I have belonged to your Facebook thing, but the time lapsed off of it. But I'd be interested in printed on a transparency with some kind of a white background that you can hang on a wall and turn on and off a light to light it. Is there techniques for doing that?
Yep, a couple approaches you can take. One is the Pictorico film I mentioned is translucent base. The other thing I found is if immediately after you bond the print to the lens, on most of these materials, you can actually take and tear the base off. The adhesive and the inkjet overcoat, which is the receptive layer for the inks, are so aggressive, those will stay on the lenticular sheet and the backing comes off. So at that point, you would have a transparency. You could put that on, a white light box. That would work. So there's a few ways of attacking that problem.
When you say a light box, where do you buy that? Is it sort of like the thing you light your studio up with, or?
Well, a lot of, I won't say a lot, but there are now picture frames that are backlit. And so you can look for those, do a Google search or look on Amazon, but they'll generally have LED illumination. There'll be an opal white plastic between the LEDs and the picture, and then you put your picture in the frame. The bad news is most of these you have to plug in the wall, so there's always the power issue.
Second question.
Mm-hmm.
I read in the intro that there were some problems with suppliers But when you listed all your suppliers, usual lens makers are still there. What's
Some
what
of
did
the
you mean by that?
lenses are out of stock. Like a very popular lens that people have been using has been the 20 LPI micro lens, which is good when you're doing 16 by 20 or larger lenticulars. And that they have not had, I think, for almost a year. And we don't know if they're going to make any more of it. So it's always a problem. Even the Picto Rico white film, there was a period of time where I could not find any of that in the United States for like 4 months, because I think those are made, I don't know where the material is made, but it's not here in the States, and they do a run of it, and then they often sell out that run before they have the next batch.
Done.
Thanks,
Okay.
David. Good seeing you again.
Gordon, see, you've got your hand raised. You can unmute yourself.
Yes, thanks. Thanks for that presentation, Michael. Yeah, I just had a quick question. When you're using those rotating methods, do you need to correct the individual frames at all for the keystoning that you get between those, or are the frames close enough together that it's not significant?
It's a great question, Gordon. And just want to side note, loved your social media say yesterday. But
Thank you.
lenticular has limited depth of field. And so I'm never worried about correcting the background. Usually when I use that technique, I'm photographing a person. Now, ideally, I want to have that axis rotate right around the center of their head, right at their eyes. In portraiture, you may already be aware of this, it's critical to have the eyes in focus. Even if you go back 40 years and look at the Karsh black and white portraits, they were done on 8x10 view cameras. Depth of field was very limited. They could get the eyes in focus, and by the time you got to the ears, they were already out of focus. Lenticular is something like that. So I arc the camera around the subject. When I have the series of frames, I'll then do an additional correction. I'll look for a highlight in the eye, a white spot. That's the specular reflection from one of my studio lights. And I'll line up all the frames to that spot. So in that case, the eyes will be sharp. Anything forward of the eyes, like the nose, the chin, the chest, will come forward off the surface of the print. And anything behind the eyes, the shoulders, any background will recede. So I don't worry about geometric correction of the background at all. What I'm really worried about is getting the eye sharp.
Yeah, thank you.
You're welcome. Thank you.
Two questions from the comments. One, so when you're shooting the ARC portraits, if your subject slowly moves, for instance, turning a page, they can turn the page as you continuously photograph.
Yeah. So
and then
go ahead. Can I answer the first part of that question before we go?
Yes, go ahead. Yes.
Okay. A lenticular sheet is not video. So some motions work better than others. Something coming forward or back works pretty effectively. Something going one side to the other works less effectively because you get this three-dimensional effect. One direction you would move, something would come forward off the surface, and the other direction you move, something would recede. So you really want to use minimal motions. The most effective cliche lenticular motion is the wink. Going back to the 1960s postcards of Japanese women, and probably even before that, the lady who you look at the lenticular, you see her in 3D and you move it and she winks at you. And so the wink is very subtle. I would say any facial gesture would look great if you had someone smile and then not smile, wink, blink, any of those things. But you really have to be careful with a lot of displacement. And what's part two of that question?
Part two was, do you actually have an example of what a lenticular print looks like before you've put the lens that you could show?
I think so. But I think the best way to do that, let me see. Let's see. And he's back. I'm going to show you that print, but I think the best thing to do is I'm then going to open a digital file so we can actually see that. So this particular piece was done with the 4-camera rig, and I don't know how close the Sony camera will focus. Not as close as I want to go. I will talk about, as long as we're doing this, these marks on the side and bottom. You can see those. Those are registration marks, and they allow you to line up the lenticular sheet to that print very critically. Let me open up an interlaced file. So I'm going to share my screen and go to my desktop, which is really messy at this point. And I will minimize that. I will call up Photoshop. Let's see. All right, here's one here. All right, so this is one I really enjoy, and I think this audience would. I did it at Historical Society in Menominee Falls, Wisconsin. A woman dressed in the vintage attire. She's holding a Holmes viewer, and this was shot with a Canon digital SLR on a linear slider. So here you're seeing the whole picture. We're going to zoom in on that. And I'm going to maximize this. So here we're at 200%. Let's go a little bigger. All right, this is as big as I can go, but you can see the width here to here. You can sort of see these vertical bands, right? Each one of those bands is 1/60th of an inch wide in actual space. And then these vertical columns are stripes from the, oh, I guess I could go wider, stripes from each of the different pixels. So in a situation like this, each vertical column represents a frame, so to speak, from a camera. That's due to the nature of interpolation, that's not actually correct, but that's the best way of thinking about it. All right, so
okay,
that was part 2.
I see Peter Sinclair. Peter Sinclair is waving his hands. Peter, come on into the conversation.
Hello, everybody. Mike,
hey, Peter.
Nancy, and all the rest of you all look great. From Canada, you guys look great. Anyway, my question is, in my life of 2-lens photography, is everyone hearing me, by the way?
Yes. Yes.
This is my second day on Zoom, so bear with me. I know nothing about it. Normal 2-lens photography, and most of my photography, if I do intermediates and in-betweens, of course, it always interpolates the outside images in. And you were mentioning a way to extrapolate the outside images to give yourself more parallax. Could you say what's a good way of doing that?
Yes. So let's go back to the screen share. Desktop. You know, it's really interesting. You can see this screen, I take it, right? The Lost in Space robot, right?
Yeah.
So this is a test I actually did. It's from a ViewMaster reel. Now, oddly enough, the person who gave me this ViewMaster reel was Peter Sinclair. It was room hopping, and he had just a loose reel in his packet. So I took that. I thought, hey, this is kind of cool. And then, you know, from time to time, I like to test things out, like how do you make a lenticular from a stereo pair? So I thought, well, this is kind of fun, this Lost in Space robot. So what I did was I took, well, let me back up a step. You're absolutely right. If you have a stereo pair with a normal interocular distance, That's not sufficient if you create in-between frames from those two viewpoints. You don't have enough total base. So the way around that is to do a workaround which involves taking your image, bring it into either Triaxis software or Stereo Photo Maker, and make a depth map. And from that picture and depth map combination, either of those software programs can generate all the additional frames. So I'm going to put this in anaglyph mode, and I'm going to look at this as my left frame, and that is my right frame. And if you have your anaglyph glasses, you can put that on.
Yeah.
I should hold mine in front of myself, and you can see depth here. So because of the lens I was using, in this case, a 60 LPI, and the number of frames, this is representative of the depth that finished lenticular would show. But if I look at the two outermost frames, I've got to move some things around here like that. That would be the outer frame. So those actually have more depth than the original ViewMaster stereo pair had, but those are what's required for lenticular. If any of you actually spend the hour and go through my presentation, I talk about this a little bit, but basically a lenticular sheet is a stereoscope. And the sheet has an angle of view. Typically for 3D lenticulars, that angle of view is about 30 degrees. Your frame series falls within that angle, and your eyes are basically seeing a subset of that 30-degree angle. So what I found, and I forgot the arithmetic because it's been some years since I've done that, but I, in my mind, say there's two sizes of prints: those that are small that you hold in your hands close to you, and those that are big and you're viewing them on the wall. So for my calculations, I said a small print is 8 by 8 inches, and a big print is 16 by 16 inches. And I looked at the viewing angle of those lenticular sheets, and there's two categories of sheets: 3D sheets and animation sheets. And just rounding everything off, a 3D sheet has about a 25-degree angle of view, an animation sheet has about a 50-degree angle of view. Your eyes also have an angle of view between the two eyeballs themselves and the sheet you're viewing. And that angle is based on the distance you are from the sheet. So to net it all out, this is where the stereo-based multiplication factor comes in. When we normally take a stereo pair, roughly 2.5-inch interocular separation. For hand-sized prints on a 3D lenticular sheet, you want 3 times that base. Okay, and that's why the NIMSL never worked, right? Because the base was too narrow, and that's why the sliders do work, because the base is bigger. If you go through that presentation, I basically have it all laid out: small print, big print, animation sheet, lenticular sheet, but it always falls between 3x and 12x the normal stereo base.
So, Michael, to puff out the parallax and using a grayscale map, do you actually, excuse me, take the pure white, pure black, and expand it through the image? In other words, turn the darker grays more dark, the whiter ones more white.
No, you don't have to worry about that, because most of the software programs basically have like an amplification mode, if you will. So you put in your grayscale depth map. I think on Triaxis Stereo Tracer, they have it in percentages. So they recommend starting at 7%. But if you needed to increase that depth, then maybe you would go up to 10%. If you wanted to decrease it, you'd go to a lower percentage. They also typically have a control.
I've tried that where it just tears so much. You go a little overboard, 12, it'll tear, the picture will tear up so badly. I find is there a better way to do it than going through the Triaxis slider and just see what it'll do for you?
Well, there are better ways, and they all involve more work. So one thing to do is to take your image and separate it into layers and apply the depth map separately to each of those layers. And the other thing you can do is actually to blur the depth map horizontally, not necessarily vertically, and that gets rid of some of that tearing. So that's the thing. I mean, that's where the art of lenticular comes in, because you're taking something you have, which is 2 pictures, and you're trying to create something you don't have, which is, 24 pictures or however many you want. Yeah,
Thank you very much.
you're welcome. Great seeing you.
Okay, Heather Lowe, let's
Heather Lowe.
unmute your microphone. Heather, you need to unmute your microphone. There you go.
Sorry.
Hey, we can hear you now.
We can hear
Okay.
you.
Okay, we can hear you. Yeah.
I had a quick question about your Chicago landscape piece. So beautiful, that the night and day one.
Oh, yes, yes, yes.
Was that a 40 LPI or was that 30? I mean, you
30.
could do 3D. It was 30?
It was 30, and it's not 3D. The picture Heather's referring to is a landscape that goes from day to night as the viewer walks by.
Oh, I thought it also had some 3D in it. It was just the flip. Okay. That was a
Yes,
beautiful
Michael,
piece.
Oh, thank
Yeah,
you.
because the lens looks very light and it was waving a little light, and the 40 LPIs don't do that. They're very rigid and thick and stuff. So
That's interesting. Well, I find just the opposite. The 40 that I use, oh, you're probably thinking the 3D 40.
The
Yes.
3D
Very
40, yeah.
rigid, yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, I use an animation 40, which is very thin. It's like a litho lens, very
Yeah,
flexible.
I like that too. Yeah.
Great seeing you, Heather.
Okay.
Yeah.
We have a raised hand from senior member Levine. Mr. Levine, you can unmute yourself.
Sorry about the title. That's my work title, and I haven't changed it.
Got it.
What I was going to do is just ask a question, which is nothing to do. I'm not as technical as you. And 20 years ago, Canon had a system where you'd print out your photo, and I don't know whether you can see that very clearly.
I can see it.
And what it does is it turns it into a lenticular. It was just a simple press of the button. And you put it in a frame, which they supplied at that stage at about $6, which again, I don't know whether you can see the lenticular framing of it. And you just slot it in. And honestly, you have a lenticular picture. Now,
Easy
I don't know
peasy.
what happened. Well, that's nothing like the real lenticulars, of which I have a number, of course. But I must say, it was an impressive home system without effort. And I just wondered, it went the way of the dodo, obviously. Anyone else ever used it? I've got about 6 of them. Those dots that you can see are because they stood on a windowsill and got the sun from behind. But I can't find the software, and I certainly can't find any of the frames. Does anyone know anything about it?
I know something about it.
Yeah.
You can get frames like that even today through ViewThrough in Las Vegas, and they're linked in that PDF document. To make the interlaced picture, you're going to have to, get software to do that. There's no simple Canon solution that exists. But for a lot of people that don't want to go through the effort of lamination, these slide-in picture frames are great. They won't have necessarily the quality, but talk about ease of use, hard to beat that.
They certainly don't have the quality. I mean, I've got printed lenticulars of my own photos, which are fabulous, but this did a reasonable job well before all that was available. What was the name of that again? Because I only came in very late, and I apologize for that.
The company is ViewThrough, ViewThru. There's a document that we're linking to in the chat. And if you click on that, you can get a PDF, and it has all the resources, including that company.
Thank you very much.
I'm pasting the link. I just pasted
Awesome.
that link into the chat again.
Awesome.
So it's
Thank
right
you
there
very
if you
much.
need it.
You're welcome.
Jared Hoffman has a hand raised. Jared, you can unmute your mic.
Hello. Hi, Michael.
Jared!
Yeah, I want to introduce myself, that I also sometimes make prints for other people who do Nimsla and Nishika shots. I have an Instagram, it's brooklyn.lenticular.printing. And my question is for you, Michael, and for anybody else that maybe has experience. I'm trying to make larger lenticulars than I ever have. I've made 16 by 20s, and I've got some micro lens 36 by 48 inch sheets. And I'm curious if anybody has just advice in terms of working with commercial printers to sort of go into their shop and and make those, and also whether anyone has experience getting large prints made either by manufacturers here in the United States or in China or in Korea, because I know they're making some really amazing prints out there. They seem like they have like, you know, factories for this. And so I'm just wondering if anybody has experience with that and any thoughts on that.
I'll start first and then we can open up to the group. And first of all, Jared, I don't know if you were here in the beginning, but in the beginning when I talked about media and I mentioned I heard good reports about Epson metallic paper, it was from Jared. So he's a provider, as he indicated, printing NIMSLO type photographs. As far as big pieces go and having them done off-site, you're going to want to talk to your individual service provider. I would always be reluctant, for example, to have them print and you try to put the lens on. I don't think that's going to work very effectively because just the nature of transport, material shrinking or expanding, and you trying to keep that print pristine before you put a lens on, I'm very reluctant to say that would work. Inkjet printers, relatively speaking, are not that expensive. I think for what you would pay for a couple commercial prints, maybe if you were going to have 5 prints made commercially, you probably could buy your own wide format inkjet printer. But there are different approaches.
What inkjet printers would you recommend?
Well, for most people, I would say any of the Epson Stylus Pros or the Canon ProGraph printers would be a good choice. If I can share my screen again and look.
I've had good luck with Sammy's in LA.
Yeah. So
Sammy's
anyway,
camera?
Sammy's camera has done good prints for me. And there's a printer at the brewery in downtown LA. And the guy actually has made lenticulars. So he's pretty good at printing. But like Michael said, transporting it, the dust factor, and there's so many things. You have to always insist they print the file exactly as is, because they start fiddling around with it on their computer, and it makes me so nervous.
And I can personally recommend for 11 by 17 or smaller than that. I've had 11 by 17s printed by Harvey Jewett at Z-Axis Prints, and Harvey's done a really excellent job.
He's great, yeah.
And Harvey is on that PDF file at the bottom. Eric, is my
He does
screen
the whole
showing?
lenticular, you know?
Yes, it is, Michael.
Okay, so I did a poll in January asking the lenticular artists on our forum what printers they were using. And if you can see that list, I don't know how clearly the type is showing. The majority of them are using Epson Pro printers of varying width, everything from, the desktop 17-inch to the, 44-inch and wider. And then the other ones they're typically using are the Canon, the ProGraph series. So all those are good printers and printers I would recommend. So, and Jared, back to your situation, if you really want to make just a few large ones, it's almost worth it to find a service provider that has a flatbed inkjet printer, so they're not even worrying about the laminating of the print to the lens sheet. You just source that all to them. I remember a few weeks ago at the New York Stereoscopic Society virtual meeting, they had a person there from Tracer Graphics in New York. I think, Jared, you and I maybe even talked about that, but I would look for a place close to you where you can actually have a personal relation with whoever's going to, print your large format work. I don't know if anyone else has insights they want to share with Jared's question.
Yeah, I do, if I could.
Yeah, Valerie.
Yes, great. I had a stereo show. It was my first one in 2012, and I really wanted to come out with a bang. So I created a lenticular, like a 38 by 38 lenticular. And here was my mistake. The image I chose was good for smaller format because the focus point was a little duck, like maybe taking up 10% of the screen. And when I set the stereo, it looked fine on a smaller format, but when I made the lenticular, it was too wide. and I sent it out to be processed. So everything was fine with the processing. I chose the wrong image for the lenticular. And when I set the stereo, I set it too deep. And so I guess my only thought would be is just choose your subject carefully. And for me, the small piece on the screen was just not effective.
And I guess I would amplify that by saying that's why you want your own printer. So much of this is trial and error and testing and refining. And you probably make 10 bad prints that you never actually bond the lenticular sheet on, but you're viewing them under a sheet before you actually have it all perfected and you go to that final step of bonding. So you have a lot of hair, Jared. I mean, you have a lot that can still be pulled out in frustration as you work with the service provider.
Thanks, everyone. Yeah.
Thank you.
Let's see. We have a raised hand from David in Melbourne, Australia.
Wow.
Hi, everyone. I kind of feel that I may have made a bit of an error in the purchase of this sheet, and I just wanted to share this problem. That sheet obviously is disappearing with that Zoom function, but the issue here is that it doesn't have the adhesive already on the shade, and I had to buy quite a lot of it, and now I've got a whole lot of this without that. That needs an adhesive when the lamination happens, and the adhesive comes in massive rolls. Right. So if you're just trying this out, then there seems to be a bit of a supply issue here, rather than and I've looked for just sheets of the adhesive sheets, but maybe Michael, do you know of a supplier that can supply the sheets in a smaller quantities?
The adhesive sheets?
Yeah. The adhesive, only the adhesive, because I've got a massive list now. I got to try and figure that out.
But something that was shared with me recently, which I have never tried, but might help you in your situation. Jake Purchase in the UK was saying you could use the 3M spray adhesive. Ah. And I have a hard time imagining that working well, but he said he knows people that have done it. And so that would be the first approach I would take. The second thing I would like to ask you is what's the dimension of those sheets?
They're pretty big. They're, I'd be guessing, I'm just guessing, they're probably 80 centimeters by about 50 centimeters, something like that.
Okay, so what you may want to consider is buying a small roller laminator and the roll of adhesive and just coating all those sheets. You can get a laminator. I'm trying to go from imperial to metric and have a hard time. So anyway, one of the smaller laminators I have is 26 inches, right? So maybe 3/4 of a meter. And it was under $1,000 US. And I knew you can get smaller ones for less, but so you'd have some investment, maybe $1,000, and probably a roll of adhesive is going to cost you somewhere between $200 and $400 US. That would be the best, but try that spray adhesive first, because if it works, that's a real, low cost punt.
Okay, I'll try that. Thank you.
Okay, you're welcome.
Can I say something?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, Heather.
View through will give you smaller pieces. I mean, he'll give you if you want a limited supply of the adhesive. What's his name? Jay at View Through.
Yeah. Yep.
He will give you some.
Okay, thank you. Yeah. Thanks, Heather.
There's a raised hand. It's M. A. Simps. You can unmute.
Yeah,
yourself.
I can you hear me?
Yes.
I just was wanting to know. I'm kind of new to the lenticular lenses. How many pictures can you fit into a print using a lenticular lens? I mean, how many? I guess it's each print would have one line per so much space of inches. How many of those prints or pictures can you fit into one lenticular photo?
Now, are you talking about a 3D picture or are you talking about a changing picture?
I'd like to know the information on both types.
Okay. Well, I guess the smallest number would be one picture, but it would absolutely have no 3D or motion, right? And the high end, I don't know personally, the most I've ever done, I think, was 240 frames. At some point, your computer will run out of, memory and oomph. Probably the real practical question, though, is what are you trying to achieve? You can make 3D lenticulars with as few as 2 frames. Like this was done by Itzhak Weissman. It's a stereo pair in a lenticular sheet. Tremendous depth, tremendous clarity and focus, but it's critical that you hold it at the right distance and in the absolute right position to see it, because if you're outside of that, it won't work at all. Most lenticular 3Ds have somewhere between 10 and 40 pictures in them, and the number is not really critical. Usually, the fewer pictures you have, the sharper the lenticular is, but it may have a jitter effect as you rotate it. The more frames in it, there's less jitter, but there's also a softness to the elements that recede far in the background or far in the foreground. For a changing lenticular picture, the best results are with 2 images, A and B. As you add more pictures, there's a tendency to have ghosting or blurring of those images. But it's art and it's photography and it's all seasoned to taste. And once again, it gets back to experimentation.
And isn't there also something of an optimized number based on the lens pitch and the DPI of the printer and sort of the technical aspects of it?
There's a standard formula and it's all kind of made up. The premise is basically that your printer, if you have an Epson, has a print head with a 720 pixel per inch resolution. If you have a Canon or HP, it's a print head with 600 pixel per inch resolution. As it turns out, those aren't true numbers. If you actually make line pairs and look at them under a loop, the resolution is greater than 300 and it's less than 600. No one really knows what the actual number is because there's a difference if you're looking at black-white pairs or if you're looking at, medium gray versus, white or black pairs. But typically what they would say is if you have an Epson printer and you're using this 720 pixel per inch print head and you're using a lenticular sheet that has a pitch of 60 lenticules per inch, you divide 720 by 60 and you get a value of 12, and that would indicate that you should use 12 frames in that lenticular picture. So I always say, good starting point. You can use more, you can use fewer, but you're absolutely right, Eric. That's sort of a formula that's just been passed down year after year after year.
So it's 6 o'clock. We're coming to the end here, but I know there's still some people who'd love to continue the discussion. First off, I'd like to mention that we have added a happy hour. There's going to be another Zoom happy hour similar to what we did last night. And I believe that is scheduled to start at 6:30. But you know what? Since that's a happy hour and we can have fun, we can stay in here for a little while longer if more people want to discuss it. And I think maybe what we can do at this point is open it up to more people talking. If you'd like to unmute yourself and
you know what I do too, like
about lenticulars.
Sorry, Eric, I'd like to just jump in about the.
No, go ahead, Dave. Yeah.
Okay, so the happy hour is going to be sort of focused toward first timers because we had a lot of wackiness last night, but we realized there's a lot of just kind of old timers taking up the space. So we want to kind of give the space for new people and just sort of let's give a round of applause actually for all the people whose first time it is here. This is only like possible to do.
Oh yeah,
right. I go over this thing. So a lot of new faces and a lot of different people to meet. So in the happy hour, we'll try to meet as many new people as we can. So back to the lenticular.
But what that also means, since we want to focus on newcomers at the happy hour, we can actually keep this discussion going for a little bit longer. So yeah, if you have some comments that you'd like to make about lenticulars, or you have more questions,
Eric, I have a question. I have a question for you.
Unmute yourself. Yeah, yeah.
You said something about using the looking glass as a
oh yeah
for your lenticulars.
Yeah. Yes, as a matter of fact, I recently I was given a project to do by Bob Firmanek at the 3D Film Archive. He was doing a restoration of the Abbott and Costello 2D movie, Africa Screams, and he was doing it on Kickstarter, and he had asked me if I could come up with a lenticular insert that he could include as a bonus for his Kickstarter backers. And I'd been experimenting, playing around with the looking glass display. If you haven't seen one, the looking glass is sort of a computer monitor. Oh yeah, Dave's got one in his hands right there. Yeah, Dave's got one right there. It's a small computer monitor that has a lenticular screen to it and an acrylic block that kind of lifts the image into space and effectively give you a glasses-free screen. You can load like a sequence of 45 images into it and get a really nice image in there. So yeah, so what I did was in Photoshop, I built this whole sequence of images from an extreme left to an extreme right based on the Africa Screams movie poster. And I was able to load my images into the looking glass to sort of proof what it was looking like. And then what I did was I sent my frames off to Z-Axis Prints and had him print me up an image that was about the same size as the looking glass screen as a proof. And when he sent it back, I compared the amount of depth I was getting on the looking glass to the amount of depth that I got in the print from Harvey, and was able to figure out, it wasn't exactly the same, but I was able to figure out then what I needed to do to make it look right on the looking glass and have it work well when Harvey printed it. And actually, you know, I have an animated GIF I can show you. Let me share my screen. Let me get this up here of what the extremes ended up looking like, what the image ended up looking like that I sent off. Here we go. Okay, so this kind of gives you an idea of what it looked like. There's a couple little aberrations in here that I fixed before I sent it off, but you kind of get the idea. And what was great was, in addition to being able to see it like this, I could actually load it into the looking glass and make sure that everything was working without ever having to waste any ink or waste any lens material. So once I kind of had that in my head as to what the looking glass translates into in a real world print, I could just work on the looking glass and know that as long as the looking glass had a certain amount of depth, it was going to work in my print.
How did it work out with that type? That type is floating way out in front. Did the lenticular?
Yes, yeah. It turned out really good, and we even did some 11x17 prints that turned out looking really good.
That's a good way to test it.
For Michael.
Yes.
So you mentioned a few U.S. suppliers for the plastic lenticular material. Are there some that might preserve the color of the photograph better than the other and for quality?
The biggest issue would be actually the colorants from your printer. If you use a pigment-based printer, that would be better. Dye-based printers have a tendency to light fade. There have been lenticular sheets manufactured in the past, and when I say the past, like in the 60s, that would yellow over time. So the sheet itself would change hue. But I think if you stick with the PET plastics that are used today and pigmented inks from either Epson or Canon printer, you probably would have no problems.
So I have a Canon Pro 100, and I think they make a more archival ink than their standard. Is that correct?
I'm not familiar with it. I actually thought the Canon Pro printers used the pigmented inks, which would be the archival ink. I didn't think there was a
I think
choice
so,
of using
but
a dye.
they've been good so far, but I just didn't know. I've only purchased their standard.
Yeah, I would go to Google, type in, the Pro 100 printer and type in the word inks as well and see if they say they're pigmented. I'm almost certain they are.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Anyone else have something?
Peter
Peter's waving his
Sinclair's
hands
waving.
again. Come on in, Peter. Yeah, you're welcome to. Anyone can unmute your mic at this point.
Oh, thank you very much.
Let's have a discussion.
Okay, this is maybe slightly off topic, but maybe not. Does anyone know how to use the Google Earth to get multiple points of view of houses, cities, etc., to be able to print as lenticulars or put on a looking glass screen? Are there tutorials on YouTube or something that'll say how to do that? Anyone know about that?
If I were doing it, I would actually set up a screen capture and just move my mouse and actually move the scene in a linear manner.
Well, actually, Michael, you can use the arrow keys, and if you use, the left arrow key, you can just go in small increments directly.
Perfect.
Good idea.
On the x-axis.
The tricky thing is that I've tried to do this, and the increments are not necessarily exactly consistent. You can definitely do it for capturing stereo pairs. If you were trying to do it for lenticular, it might be trickier because the distances between each screen capture might not be
That might be okay.
precise.
Once you got some stereo, you can do all the interpolations and make other.
Right.
So,
Or you could hold down an arrow key if you were capturing video of your screen and just get steady linear motion, and then you can go and grab frames out of that video.
can somebody send me a link or something on how to do all this? Or
Yeah, Peter, I'll see if I can find anything, and I'll
another question I had was, for those that are familiar with Looking Glass, you probably know they have a kind of quickie grayscale map thing that'll, in 5 seconds, you load a flat picture, will give you a rough grayscale map of it. It's a bit dirty, but it's fast. This is what it's a Google program, somebody said, and I wondered if anyone knows where one can get this quick grayscale map maker out of a flat photo. Nothing else.
Yes, it's actually there's a Google artificial intelligence. It's a Google AI project. There's actually some notes for that I believe Masuji Sudo had posted. I'll see if I can track those down and maybe post that in the chat at the happy hour if I can find it.
Thank you so much, Eric. And also, last question. I'm completely unfamiliar with the Oculus Quest VR, and I'm interested in vintage images and art conversions, things like that. Would any of that look good on an Oculus VR setting, my still pictures that are that type of format? Vintage and art conversions, flat photos, basically. Is there a way to jazz them up?
That's another forum, Peter.
Come on. I don't feel comfortable until I've heard a dig from Ron,
Hold on.
We're welcoming here, Peter. Yeah, Ron should be able to answer that.
Yeah, he's from Boston, what the heck. Anyway, that's my last question. If anyone has, I've heard it's worth getting the Quest anyway for all the other great things it'll do. So if it'll do my little rinky-dink stuff, that would be great.
It will.
Okay, that's all I needed to know, Ron. I'll be bugging a few to find out how. Okay. Anyway, love you guys. I'm glad we're back together, even in a virtual world. I gotta go watch the hockey game.
And let's see.
Oh, do you mean where they're
hey.
only playing in Canada?
Yeah, and in August too. Yeah.
Hey, I know John Ripkalvis has wanted to say something. John, you're there.
Thank you.
Is your mic?
Oh, yes, thank you. No, I just want to make a little comment here about something that goes way back in the earlier part of the program. But anyway, you were discussing the NIMSLO camera and the stereo base. And many years ago, I took a standard 4-lens NIMSLO and actually converted it to double the stereo base between each of the lenses. And the way I did this was to actually, between each lens, put a double-sided front surface mirror. And by doing this, each side reflected the image from the adjacent lens, so that we ended up with essentially 4 images that were double. Each one was double the stereo base of the unmodified NIMSLO.
Wow, I'd love to see a picture of that. That sounds pretty cool.
I'll have to see. I think I've got a picture of it. Yeah, I've either got a picture. I know I've got a drawing of it, but I think I've got a picture too someplace. But I really got to hunt for it. It's. I mean, this is like maybe 20 years ago or so. You know.
That's cool,
Well,
John.
are you familiar with David Berder's Birdlow cameras?
He showed that.
Yes, David Berder. Let me see if I can. Here we go. This was the Birdlow. He did several different versions of it.
Right.
David took NIMSLO cameras and Frankensteined them together into multi-lens versions of the NIMSLO. And he did several. This one is a 12 lens here. I believe he also had a 24 lens. And maybe a 16 lens. Anyway, those were rather interesting cameras that David customized.
He also owned a Bonet.
Yeah, we went to a restaurant, Don Parks and David Berder, and they actually, while we were waiting for our meal, took those cameras apart and put them back together and merged it while we were waiting for our dinner, and made Don Parks, who never did it before, show him how easy it was.
It's interesting that you mentioned the Bonet, because that reminded me that the Bonet had, I think, 3 different versions of that particular camera for lenticulars. And Harvey Prever actually owned 2 of them, 2 of the different ones, but one of them actually worked by doing just what Michael said, by actually going on a track in a circle around the subject. That's
actually the exact Bonet camera that I visited last year. It is currently in the living room of Harvey Prever's daughter here in Los Angeles.
I'm hoping they're still continuing this. The last time I talked to his daughters was, again, like 20 years ago. But at that time, they were actually very active in trying to continue this, but for one specific market. They were doing for the a religious market in Mexico. And they were actually using the Bonet camera to shoot small statuary and do things like manger scenes and things like that, and create the lenticulars, which they then sold to people in Mexico.
So I think the
for those of you who don't know the name Harvey Prever, you've probably seen some of his work. He did those wonderful 1950s lenticular light boxes that promoted many of the Hollywood movies. There was Zsa Zsa Gabor, Jerry Lewis, Dean Martin. and he did those in a
John Wayne.
studio. John Wayne. He did those in a studio here on the Sunset Strip, and did quite a lot of Hollywood studio work and a lot of other commercial work. Actually, one of the really fun things that I got to see. The camera is not being used currently for anything, but she has been maintaining her father's archive. So she actually has a cold storage at her house where she has all of the original glass prints, all of the stacks of the original glass and the lenses that go with them. I got to put on some gloves and hold some of those in my hands and place the lenses on, and oh my God, they are stunning.
They still match.
They still match. Yes, they were all done on glass.
Wow. Yes, that's very, very stable as far as, shrinkage and so forth. You don't have those problems with the glass. And some of those original images were really fantastic. And we mentioned, I think it was John Wayne. I'm not really sure. I'm trying to think myself if that was the one, but it was one of the pictures. The particular person in the picture was actually smoking a cigarette. And the exposure was made, and you could actually, while you're looking at the 3D image, you could actually see the smoke drifting up from the cigarette that he's holding in his hand. So there was actually both 3D and motion in that particular image.
So from what I understand, I think the Berter Bonet camera actually did the interlacing within the camera. Is that right?
Yes, that's how the Bonet cameras worked. Yes, they interlaced it directly onto the glass plate.
And there's no other camera system that did that, as far as we know.
No, there was another guy in the 40s whose name slips my mind that made cameras like that.
I met a guy.
And I'm not sure how did Victor Anderson's camera work? Was Victor using Bonet cameras as well?
I don't think so.
I recently heard about an early color motion picture film system, which it was not for 3D, but it used lenticular, I believe lenticular sheets. Some of you all may know about this. I think there was a lenticular sheet on the lens, and then there was another one on the projector lens. And so it was actually black and white film. I guess the sheets had colored bands. So you were capturing 3 bands of black and white right next to each other. And then when they were projected back through the same type of sheet, you got a color image.
It's even more simple than that, because that did happen in the 30s, but then later in time, like in the 80s, Polaroid had Polavision, and it was the same basic idea. It was a black and white emulsion, and they actually had red, green, blue microscopic stripes alternating on the one side of that emulsion. And so when you would project from back to front, you would get a color image. But as far as developing, they only had to develop, the black and white component.
I remember.
Yeah, and Max, the
I was just going to say.
Go ahead, Peter.
Vivian Walworth, who worked with Polaroid, and
yes, Vivian.
Single frame, a 35 millimeter frame, like a sort of stereo jet, tiny frame of a movie test they did, and it was all like a real stereo jet. You put on the glasses, and there it was. So it was like perfectly registered one film Polaroid test they did.
Are you talking about the stereo jet?
Yes, Ron would know a lot about that. Where I even worked with stereo jets a bit, and I tried to make the biggest frame that would fit in a 35 millimeter projector, which is like one of those super frames. It's 1.5 inches square or something, and you could get a rough 8x10, perfect quality, except it was low res. But you could actually make stereo jets to just stick in an ordinary ectograph, came up perfectly, just low res. So
well,
on inkjet.
Well, we've just about got to close things out here. It's about 6:25. We got 5 minutes before the happy hour. Max, I did just want to comment that 1930s lenticular color film process was actually called Kodacolor. So it was
Okay,
Kodacolor
yes.
before the other Kodacolor. So if you search on lenticular Kodacolor, you can find more information out about how they used lenticular lenses to make color film.
There was some footage circulating on the internet recently, and it was I forget which first lady it was, but it was some president's wife who was shooting color footage on the grounds of the White House as home movies, and it was like the first color home movies shot on the White House grounds, and it was from absurdly early. It might have been.
Let's give
Mrs.
Michael.
Hoover.
Let's give.
Wow.
Let's give Michael a big round of applause.
Great.
So much
Thank
information.
The expert.
And I want to thank all of you. The questions were really fantastic. I learned a lot from this, and there's a bunch of things I want to experiment with now. And I hope that you've all been encouraged to try out your own lenticulars or expand on what kind of work you've been doing. And we're going to close this down. We'll move over to the happy hour. And as we've said before, the discussion doesn't have to stop just because this Zoom is closed. If you'd like to continue lenticular discussions, you're welcome to go onto Facebook and open a Facebook room, or open your own Zoom session and invite people into it. And we're going to hopefully keep the talk of all things 3D happening as we go into the night tonight.
Eric, we had successfully we had a room with 5 people in it on Facebook, a Facebook room, and I was showing Gary Shacker how to put the stereo theater interlaced on the Zolman monitor to watch using Pop Player.
Oh, fantastic!
So, yeah,
Very
so we
cool.
had a little.
Okay.
Yeah, it works. Everyone do it.
Yeah, I just quick want to mention something too. Yeah, is that there was also a Chinese lenticular camera that used 8x10 either sheet film or glass plates, but they also used a glass lenticular sheet to actually shoot through. And this was built with a, I seem to recall they also had a conventional lens on the front, but that the lenticular actually provided the stereoscopic information for copying onto lenticular prints.
So cool.
It's called a W camera, I believe. And the lens moved, but the camera was stationary. The lens kind of switched sideways, and they use that difference through the, as John said, through a lenticular back and a paper behind that, or film,
Correct.
Yeah, but it was W. I believe it was called a W 8x10 camera or something.
Yeah, something like that.
Okay.
Yeah. Your description
well,
was very good, Peter.
We'll look that up, and we can continue this when we get to the happy hour. But I got to close this now. So we will see you in the next Zoom meeting in just 2 minutes. Great. Thank you.
All you guys in Canada.